Thank you, everybody, for attending. I see folks streaming in, which is great. I mean streaming in as a pun, I guess. Okay, it's a pun. So my name is Paul Golin. I am the Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and our social justice initiative is called Jews for a Secular Democracy. And I just want to start off by introducing a bit about who we are and what we're doing, and then I'll introduce our panelists. The Society for Humanistic Judaism has been around over 50 years, and we are a denomination of American Judaism. And the issue that unites us as far as politics or social justice is really the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion that is protected by the US Constitution in the First Amendment. And we decided to really ramp up our efforts around helping the Jewish community recognize how many issues are actually tied into freedom of religion. And it's so important to us as our movement is secular Jews, but we felt that this was a pluralistic initiative because most Jews, I think, can appreciate the amazing benefits for Jews in America that have come from having religious freedom. And not just Jews, but all religious minorities in this country. So many have been able to thrive because we're not discriminated against in the same ways that other countries have historically their religious minorities. So we take very strongly the benefits and the value of separation of church and state, not just for us, but for all Americans. And of course, there are great organizations out there working to protect the separation of church and state, like, for example, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, or the Interfaith Alliance, which comes at it from a religiously pluralistic position. And there are great Jewish organizations working on the issues themselves from a social justice perspective, but they're not really hammering away necessarily as it being a First Amendment issue the way we think we can and should be. And so we wanted to create this initiative to kind of raise up and elevate this notion that issues like secular education or reproductive rights or LGBTQ equality, which not all Jews, but a huge majority of Jews are supportive of, actually relates to a separation of church and state. If the government is not taking the position of one religion over other religions, then many of these issues look very different than they do today. And in fact, in most, if not all other Western countries, they're not dealing with these same challenges that we are, such as, teaching evolution, for example. So today, we thought we would focus on secular education. In part, what made us think about this is how important science has all of a sudden become in all of our lives, right? Regardless of what you believe. And certainly if praying gives you comfort, by all means. But I would argue that our salvation is going to come from a vaccine, and that science and doctors and immunologists and all kinds of the folks who are really working on this on the ground are the ones who are going to solve it. And I'm concerned at the increase, it seems, in science denial that we've seen in our lifetimes, although I understand a bit about what the history has been about science versus religion. Obviously, I don't think it's an either or, and I think we can coexist between religion and science, but certainly religious fundamentalism and science has been in conflict in the US for hundreds of years, and we'll get into that. And so especially today, when people are being instructed on how to conduct themselves based on our best understanding of science, if folks are going to deny that science, and by folks, I'm including folks who occupy the highest office in the land, might be denying that this science is real, then it becomes a concern for all of us, because clearly, if this shows anything at all, the coronavirus, it's that we're all connected. We're all interconnected. This is not a virus that's discriminating against one religion or another. This is about humanity. So science is so incredibly important. Science education is so important and has long been an issue of separation of church and state. So we wanted to make sure that when we, put these ideas out there as an initiative, a Jews for Secular Democracy initiative, that we address secular education as well. And I'm not an expert on it, but I'm looking forward to speaking with you all as experts. And one other point, which we didn't yet communicate about when we were inviting the panelists, but I'm also recognizing that everyone is homeschooling now. So there, you know, when we start talking about this down the line, I mean, I'm fully expecting that my kids are going to bust into this room at some point during the webinar. So, you know, I'm curious to also think about, as we go, what does it mean for folks or for society that we don't know what's necessarily being taught at home now that everyone is homeschooling? And obviously we all hope that this is as short a term experience as we can possibly get. So I want to thank our panelists for being here and introduce them. So first, I will be having a conversation with Naftuli Moster, who's the Executive Director of YAFFED, Young Advocates for Fair Education. And then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Sarah Levin, who is Program Coordinator for Jews for Secular Democracy, to ask Bertha Vazquez some questions. She's the Director of Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And then my colleague, Lincoln Dow, who's Community Organizer for Jews for Secular Democracy, will ask some questions to Brandon Haught, who is Communications Director for Florida Citizens for Science and author of Going Ape, Florida's Battle Over Evolution in the Classroom. So again, thank you all for being here. And we will also build in some time to respond to questions in the chat. And also, if the other panelists have some clarifying questions as well. But Naftuli, I wanted to start with you. And so today's conversation is going to be particular for the Jewish community, but also broadly for the wider American society. So let's start off with the particular. Can you tell us a bit about the work that you do with YAFFED and why you do it?
Great. So first of all, Paul, thank you so much for inviting me onto this important panel. So I run an organization, I founded it a few years ago, that is attempting to improve secular education in ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic yeshivas, mainly across New York, but perhaps spreading beyond that. A lot of people don't realize this. There's a bit of a stereotype, maybe a good one, that Jews are all highly educated and value education. And that is true for the most part, perhaps, and used to be maybe even more true. But amongst ultra-Orthodox Jews, that education only extends to religious education. When it comes to secular education, they not only don't value it, they actually actively have disdain for it, or if you will. So I'll tell you a little bit of my story and weave in, you know, how I got to do my work. When I was 20 years old, I developed this thirst, this interest in becoming a psychologist. I saw a lot of mental illness in my surroundings that I thought went undiagnosed and untreated, and I thought I'd be good at it. So I began looking into going to a college. I barely knew the word college, but you know, someone pointed me to the direction of an Orthodox college. Actually, it's a branch of Torah college, and I went in there. I didn't know any of the terminology, but I said I want to become a psychologist. I didn't understand any of the words on the signs of the walls in the school, or which office is the bursar, the registrar. As soon as I began talking, it was clear I don't know what a college degree means, what a major, what a minor is, or but it became even more problematic when they asked me if I had a high school diploma, because that's the minimum that I would need to get in there. And I didn't know what a high school diploma was. In fact, I thought I never attended high school because I attended yeshiva, never used the word high school in that context. So they asked me to go to my yeshiva and get a letter. The letter said nothing, just that I completed high school, but there was no transcript, and I didn't have a high school education. So then there was another way for me to get in there. If I do a certain entrance exam, I would have to write an essay and do an easy math quiz. I couldn't do either. I didn't know what the word essay was, let alone how to write one. They really wanted me as a student, so they tried to help me on the spot. Maybe it wasn't so kosher of how they did it, but But ultimately, I managed to get in, and that's where my major struggle began, because you go to college and you expect to build on a foundation of knowledge, right? That's why you go to elementary, middle, and high school. Then you go to college. I went to college and I was trying to both get an elementary level education and a college education. So why? My education in yeshiva, that's what I attended, was as follows. And in most of the elementary and middle school years, we received a maximum of 90 minutes of secular education a day, only 4 days a week. And it happened at the end of the school day. So usually from approximately 3:30 to 5 p.m. The rest of the day was Judaic studies only, all of it taught in Yiddish. The secular studies consisted of just basic English and arithmetic. It was taught by incompetent and unqualified teachers, often graduates of the same system. And it was a joke. The kids thought it was a joke. The teachers largely thought it was a joke. I mean, the kids didn't just think it was a joke. They thought it was profane. They would literally say, they would use the Hebrew word for it, tumah. Oh, it's tumah, it's profane. Or when am I ever going to need it? So the attitude was that it's a waste of time or worse. So this was in elementary and middle school. In high school, we got cut off completely from secular education. Once we entered high school, our school days actually got longer. So we would attend yeshiva from as early as 6:30 or 7 a.m. It would go all the way till 8:30 or 9 p.m. But we would study exclusively Judaic studies. So even the little English and math that we would have in elementary and middle school now went out the window. So throughout our years, we never learned any science, never learned any social studies, forget about any other subjects that are taught in public schools. So again, fast forward, I'm in college, I'm struggling immensely. I can't begin to give you the many examples. You know what, let me tell your audience, I might at least a little bit of humor during these dark times. When I first got into college, I had to take remedial English, 8 credits worth of remedial English, which did not count towards my degree. So I took English, and I was for the first time learning about contractions, meaning where 2 words combine, are, aren't, whatever. So I come home proudly. I come from a very large family, and I have a lot of sisters clustered around me. And the girls tend to get a better education in yeshiva, and because they're not allowed to learn Judaic studies, most of it, so they have more time for secular studies. Anyway, so they're there chatting in English often, and I want to show off my newly acquired English skills. So I just proudly say, I amn't going somewhere. And they burst out laughing and explaining to me, you know, that's not a word and so forth. So I was using my brains, and I think that's probably the biggest crime here, that we're talking about people who are smart. I consider myself a smart person. I was always, you know, great in Judaic studies, and just in general, I was a top student, but I simply didn't know. And interestingly, in this case, I tried to apply the concepts that I learned about other combination, is or isn't, and are and aren't, and apply it to something else. And sure enough, it was a big joke, because, you know, you really need to learn these subjects. I also had to take some remedial English courses. Anyway, so during this process, it was a lengthy process. I got a job working in a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, because, you know, in theory, that's the only thing I qualified to do, schlepping boxes. But I always like to point out that I wasn't qualified to do that either, because gym or sports was also not taught in our schools, none. So I was a scrawny little Hasidic guy, lifting heavy 40-pound boxes all day long. And I didn't know anything about science or about, what do you call it? You know, eating healthily and, or diet. So I lost tremendous amount of weight very quickly. I didn't know how this works. But the point is, I was struggling immensely. And I decided, you know, it occurred to me that what had happened to me and what's happening to tens of thousands of children who grow up Hasidic and go to these yeshivas is a form of neglect. At the time, I never heard the word educational neglect. I thought I'd be the first one to coin it. So I looked it up, and sure enough, I found that it exists. And furthermore, someone I got in touch with, a reporter, actually pointed me in the direction of New York State's law, which required in crystal clear terms that all non-public schools must provide an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to public schools, meaning you could be better, you could be the same, but you can't be worse. In addition to the law, there were guidelines, and the guidelines were very clear. What must non-public schools teach? I quote them. What must non-public schools teach? And it went on to break it down. Grades 1 to 6, you have to teach English, math, science, social studies, New York history, US history, and a bunch of different subjects. And then middle school, and then high school. And I'm looking at these lists of subjects of which we received maybe half of them, right? Taught as an afterthought by unqualified teachers only, you know, in some elementary and middle school grades. And I'm thinking, how is this possible? It's happening in plain sight, and it's in blatant violation of the law. So I began, you know, asking around and speaking to some attorneys and so forth. And again, I didn't know the difference between attorneys. I contacted business attorneys to ask them ask them to do pro bono work. And they were like, this is not my field of work. Anyway, finally, I managed to find a civil rights attorney who honestly didn't believe me. And he said, do me a favor, bring together a group of people. We'll go around the room. We'll hear the story. And we'll see what we could do. And that's what I did. Without knowing this, that was my first time doing community organizing. And I brought together a group of 20 to 25 yeshiva graduates. We went around the room. None of us went to the same exact yeshiva, but we all went to Hasidic boys yeshiva. And the stories were practically identical. I mean, there's a slight spectrum. You could say that some offer 1 hour in elementary, middle school, and some do up to 2, but usually it clusters around 90 minutes and none in high school. Keep in mind, there are a handful of Hasidic elementary and middle schools that also teach zero secular education. So I'm being a little bit generous when I say they teach 90 minutes. So that's kind of like how it all started. And initially we were talking about lawsuits, and then it kind of moved to be just in general a larger advocacy effort to get the state to enforce its own laws. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, a large nutshell.
Great, and thank you. And so obviously your experience was not unique to you. There's a whole group. I think because I've been following your work, there are a couple of dozen yeshivot that you're focusing on that aren't teaching kids to a certain standard. Is that about the right number? So we're talking about actually, like potentially tens of thousands of kids?
Yeah, if I have to guess, there are at least 60,000 ultra-Orthodox children in New York State that are being denied a basic education, that receive the kind of education that I've described. Just think about it, that you have 60,000 high school kids receiving no secular education whatsoever, coming out not knowing what an essay is, let alone what a molecule or a cell. You know, I forgot to mention, that's actually when I decided to look into it. It was, you know, I was struggling through college, but I had delayed intro to biology. I had to take one hard science or something. And I delayed it till the very end because I knew it was going to be murder. I'm not going to be able to do it. And finally, when I took it, and I was at that point, I had transferred to a CUNY, the College of Staten Island, and surrounded by a bunch of very average public school kids. But it was for me that the professor had to keep going a step back and another step back and another step back to bring me up to the basic entry level of biology and science. So that's kind of like how it all started.
Great. And so my question, I have a couple of questions that I'll just combine. And folks, if folks who are attendees have questions, the chat box is where you can ask them. So there's if you scroll over the screen, and you'll see a little word at the bottom of the screen if you're on a PC, a laptop, that says chat, and then you can ask your question in there. But so it's kind of a two sides to the coin question that we're always looking at Jews for a Secular Democracy, which is, first of all, how do you see your work in the context of the First Amendment freedom of both allowing religions to have freedom and yet not favoring a religion over others by allowing them to potentially do harm to the general public? Like, do you see your work in the context of that kind of balance? I'll ask the second one second. So.
Sure. So first of all, let me begin by telling all our viewers that I only heard about the Constitution after I was 20 or something, when I was an adult. As a child, we never heard about the Constitution. The only Constitution we hear about are the Aseres HaDibros, basically the Jewish Torah Constitution. So So just pointing out how poor the education is. You know, people think that these are schools like others, but okay, maybe they're like failing public schools or something, or quote unquote, right? No, the worst failing public school in the entire country teaches English and math and science and social studies. Maybe they're not doing a great job. Maybe the grades are still poor, but they teach it. Kids could learn. We weren't even taught those. So I just want to point that out, that, you know, we never ever recited the Pledge of Allegiance or sang the national anthem. People should understand we're talking about even the basics that you expect across the board. So as for the Constitution, you know, there's been a case. I want to give you a little bit of history here. In the late 1800s is when public schools became a common thing, and it became mandatory, right? Compulsory education. At the time, governments were like, everyone needs to go to public school. They created public schools, everyone needs to go to public school. And individuals who have discovered schooling beforehand and sent their kids to private schools sued. They said, no, why should we have to? We've been going to school. You know, so the courts at the time ruled that yes, you could send your kids to private schools, but the government has the right to implement minimum standards that are plainly for the benefit of society. And that's really what this is about. You could see modern Orthodox Jewish schools, even some ultra-Orthodox schools. In fact, even Hasidic girls' schools, they split their day half Jewish, half secular education. Whereas with the Hasidic boys, they're going to claim that teaching half of the day, 3.5 to 4 hours of secular education violates their religion. It's just impossible, right? So what we're saying, we're actually seeking that kind of balance. Give the kids the tools they need to succeed and to be members of society. So that also, you know, an important thing that often goes unnoticed is that, as we all know, the ultra-Orthodox community tends to vote in higher numbers, right? And some people put it as like, oh, you see, they're all civically engaged. It's not exactly civically engaged when you basically vote according to someone else's, you know, dictate. But the worst part is that when you vote without any understanding of bigger issues, right? If you've never learned about the environment, how our actions contribute to the destruction of the environment, for instance, yeah, sure, you're going to vote for the guy who promises not to get rid of plastic bags or not to, you know, curb emissions and stuff like that. So, because you see it as a nuisance and as a waste of taxpayer money and things like that. So those things are very important, not just for Hasidic people or for Jewish people, but really for society. But again, just to answer your question, what we're pushing for is a balance where you get to teach plenty of Jewish and religious studies, but you still provide a minimum, the minimum tools and skills kids need for the future.
Great. And so the kind of other side of the issue that we're always trying to think about in this initiative is the Jewish value. So is there also a case that you make about why universal access to secular education is actually a Jewish value? Do you speak to folks on kind of that level?
It really depends on the audience. I'll tell you, ultra-Orthodox Jews don't exactly abide by such a value. Again, to them, generally speaking, I don't want to say them as in, you know, but generally speaking, ultra-Orthodox Jews believe that education, the value of education is Jewish education. You know, as we talk about the current situation, you know, homeschooling, modern Orthodox Jewish schools were some of the first to shut, and they immediately implemented a remote learning, and they'll do Jewish and secular studies. Ultra-Orthodox schools, when they finally shut, it's basically free fall. They don't have technology, but what they do have is every home has a set of a Talmud, has the Torah, has the Jewish books. They have plenty, and every father knows enough to learn with their sons or their daughters, but not Talmud. They're not allowed to. But basically, they're learning. They just don't consider secular studies learning. So there's a different value here. But I'll tell you, you know, when I speak broadly like this, I want to point out that there's a large segment of the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities that believe that the education needs to be improved. When I speak to some Hasidic people, oftentimes they tell me as many as 2/3 or even 3/4 want to see improvements. But I want to explain that improvements can look differently to different people. We have a problem in quantity and quality, right? We're talking about in quantity, They're learning maybe 90 minutes, 2 subjects, only grades 3 to 7 or 3 to 8 tops, right? And then in terms of quality, we're talking about incompetent teachers, poor attitude towards secular education. And we're saying all of these things need to be improved. But within the Hasidic community, there's a bit of a spectrum. Some people would say, yeah, I think the 90 minutes that we have now is enough, but they should take it seriously. Because at the moment, it's a joke. Some people, some kids treat it as recess. Others say that I want them to increase it to 2 hours and so on and so forth. What we're saying is we need to add time, should be more time per day. It should extend to high school. More subjects need to be taught, and the teachers should be competent. So we want essentially a bit of all of the above.
And for folks who don't do what you did, which was basically bust out of it on your own, through your own thinking and logic and fortitude to go find the resources for yourself, for all of those thousands or tens of thousands of folks who come out with no education, what is life like for them afterwards when they're adults?
Well, I could tell you what it was for me. Like I said, when I first came out, I worked in a warehouse, by myself, doing menial labor. And again, going back to the point that I consider myself a smart person, and there's a bit of a major, I don't know if the word is cognitive dissonance, but it's a type of mental pain, if you will, walking around with boxes on your shoulder, but thinking I could have been a doctor. I could be a doctor, and it's extremely painful. So many people work in warehouses, drive buses, drive trucks. Where I worked in a warehouse, it was a relatively small one. Next to me, there was another warehouse that was filled with Hasidic people. There's another thing. I mean, obviously, dependence on government assistance is basically the way of life, and I'm not saying it in a derogatory way. These individuals are victim of a system. They come out, they need to be able to support themselves. One of the first things married couples do is they go they file for public assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, Section 8, and so forth. And again, good for them. For many of them, it's the only way to survive. But of course, the system shouldn't be allowed to cause this. And then you have some who employ each other. If one Hasidic person has become successful, they tend to employ each other. B&H Photo is a good example, and everyone often points, oh, look, it's owned by a Hasidic man. I'm like, exactly, one Hasidic man, you're lucky that he's able to employ other Hasidic men. But many of those people who get jobs in B&H, they would never be able to get a job elsewhere, because the first thing they ask you is, do you have a bachelor's degree? Oh, I don't even have a high school diploma. Get out of here, So it's, and then you have a handful of entrepreneurs who are very successful, oftentimes by luck. They buy off a bunch of cheap property in Greenpoint, and suddenly a few years later it becomes a hip neighborhood, and they're multi-millionaires. And they can support each other. Charity is a big deal in the ultra-Orthodox community, mostly charity from within. But
also they also rely on government support, right? A lot of folks are using government support.
Like I mentioned, that too.
Right. I was going to say, just to get to a bit of the questions from the chat. So there was a little bit of confusion, I think, that whether New York State has rules about what needs to be taught. And you mentioned that what YAFFED is really trying to do is just get the state to enforce existing laws, right? And so the other question was, how successful have you been so far on doing that?
So if you really want me to go into this, we started off by filing a formal complaint with the New York City Department of Education. We had a list of, we basically came up with a list of 39 schools that weren't meeting minimum standards. It was signed by 52 yeshiva graduates who actually attended those schools. And we sent it to the city. The city, this wasn't the first complaint, but it was the first formal complaint that listed specific yeshivas and everything. The city said they're launching an investigation. The only thing is, it seemed that was just done for press. In terms of actually doing an investigation, it seemed like they were really pandering to ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic leaders and not doing a real investigation. So years went by, we kept hounding them, but 4.5 years went by until they finally concluded the investigation. An investigation of something that's happening in plain sight. So basically, surprise, surprise, they released a report saying that 26 out of 28 yeshivas that were investigated did not meet the minimum substantial equivalency requirements. So that's one. Interestingly, a day before that report came out, another report came out by the New York City Department of Investigations. They did an investigation into whether Mayor de Blasio or his team interfered with the city's investigation of the yeshivas. And surprise, surprise, they found that he did interfere on behalf of the yeshiva leaders. Now, let me tell you, our viewers, about what they found. They found that they made a deal that the mayor would hold off releasing an important report of the findings in exchange for securing mayoral control of the city. Keep in mind, this is a big deal. Generally speaking, there are school districts around the state and around the country where they get elected and they hire a superintendent. New York City got its unique status where the mayor controls the city education department. He hires a chancellor, which is like the superintendent, and they have to renew it every few years. It was up for renewal, and apparently somehow yeshiva leaders managed to hold that hostage unless he delays the investigation. It just goes to show you the tremendous power that ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic leaders have locally and on a state level that make it very difficult for us to get the government to enforce. But that being said,
it's an ongoing battle. I want to make sure we get to our other panelists, but basically this is an ongoing battle that you're plugging away at, which I really appreciate. And as I mentioned, it's something I've been following closely. And I came to one of your press conferences on the steps of City Hall, which was very cool. And for a very small nonprofit, you're making a lot of noise, which is I think certainly important to get the word out about this. And I know you guys are going to succeed in what you're trying to do, but this is a really entrenched challenge. So I give you a lot of credit for all the work that you've been doing, and really, and just as someone who's involved in the organized Jewish community, you know, your footprint in the organized Jewish community is substantial because people are really concerned about this issue, and you're the go-to person on it. So thank you so much for sharing that. And if we have time at the end and you can stick around, we might come back to get to more questions in the chat room. But I wanted to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Levin, who hopefully won't drop out again, because we're all dealing with, we're all praying to the internet provider gods to keep us online. But Sarah is gonna take over from here. Sarah.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Hi, Bertha. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to just jump right into the questions so we have plenty of time for the attendees to hear about your work. Can you just tell us first about the TIES program, why you do it, how you got involved?
Sure. You can all hear me. Hello, everybody.
Yes.
TIES stands for the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. I'm a science teacher in Miami-Dade County. I'm going on my 30th year now. And I noticed in middle school, you're really a jack of all trades. So my degree is in biology and chemistry, but I have to teach earth science. Sometimes I have to teach physics. I have to teach a bunch of stuff. There's no way you could be an expert in all of these things, at least not initially. Anyway, I love biology. I am a big fan of Richard Dawkins, read all his biology books, and I had the opportunity to meet him at the University of Miami, where we discussed evolution education and the lack thereof in this country. I told him some of the stuff that I was doing in my classroom, and he offered to come to my school and help me teach evolution. Miami-Dade County is a huge school district. It's like the third in the nation, and they invited all the science teachers to come to his talk. And then he asked me, would you do this for me nationally? Which scared me, because I am a public school teacher. That's what I am. But I thought, okay, I can do this. So I started a program where I train teachers to help other teachers. And our focus is middle school, but we have a lot of high school, and now I have stuff for elementary school too. We have 78 presenters right now who present very good, solid content, online resources, active learning ideas, labs, investigations. We present at workshops, professional development opportunities. where teachers come and we say, here's a whole unit of instruction. This is the content you need to cover. These are some great ideas, some great labs, great videos. Here's your exam. Here's everything. It's all free. And if you cover this, you're covering your evolution standards effectively. And we started in Miami, one teacher, and like I said, we're over 78 teachers now. We're over 200 workshops in all 50 US states in the last 5 years. Brandon, who's here with us today, is one of the presenters. He just presented in Tampa, Florida, a Darwin Day event in collaboration with the Museum of Science and Industry in Tampa and a local university there. So basically TIES is, to answer your question, a network of teachers who help teachers teach evolution effectively by giving them solid content and tons of free resources. And it's all available at a website called tieseducation.org. And to address the situation now where teachers are homeschooling, because when we say we're homeschooling, teachers are teaching. Parents aren't suddenly in charge of teaching. My school district handed out 42,000 laptops to children. Within 48 hours, they identified which children did not have laptops at home and gave them laptops, free Wi-Fi, and cafeteria food pickup for thousands and thousands of children. So anyway, teachers are running all over the place looking for solid online lessons. So I created a student-guided middle school lesson, a student-guided high school lesson, and I put it online, and I got 60,000 engagements, hundreds of emails, thousands of emails, because I said, if you want the answer key, email me. And I had to call the Richard Dawkins Foundation and talk to the techie and say, look, is there a form that they could fill out and they could click, I need the answer key, or I need the exam, or I need the rubric, and it just goes to them automatically, because I'm literally answering hundreds of emails every day. And this is in the last week and a half. So we're just helping teachers teach evolution across the country. I think we lost Sarah. It's frozen.
Here's Sarah. You got to unmute, Sarah.
Okay. Sorry, my screen froze for a second and I panic texted Paul. I did hear most of you, Bertha. So I wanted to follow up and ask you about challenges you might be facing in Florida, just in terms of teaching evolution and pushback you might get from school administration, from parents, and we'll be talking about that with Brandon as well. And I know that you work with teachers, I assume not just in Florida, correct? And so if there are
nationwide.
Yeah, so if there's any stories you could share from the folks you're working with in terms of the challenges they're facing, that'd be great.
Sure, I think the details of that question, I definitely defer to Brandon. He knows a lot more than I do, and that's why I'm thrilled he joined us today. But I do help teachers around the country when they get letters from parents or administrators saying, no, you need to teach alternative theories of creationism along with this. And the main thing is, it's just such a misunderstanding. It's against the law to teach intelligent design. It's unconstitutional. There's Supreme Court cases. And they still think it's okay that we should do it. As a matter of fact, 62% of the American public thinks that we should teach creationism alongside evolution in our schools. And it just shows you the pervasiveness of the problem, that they don't even understand that we're not even supposed to do that. Teachers are by nature non-confrontational. So I basically tell them, look, tell them that you're teaching what the state standards say you should be teaching. And with that simple sentence, you're saying, I'm not discussing this any further and it's not up to me. I think that's the best way. But I do have teachers who tell me that kids will all come to the classroom with their Bibles. This was in North Carolina, placing all the Bibles on the desks and refusing to listen. I have a teacher in Georgia who started a hiking club. She picked up a shell that's a fossilized shell. We have them here in Florida too, and said, look, isn't this cool? Georgia was underwater 150,000 years ago. Look at this fossil. Boom, they canceled her hiking club. How dare she say 150,000 years ago we were here? This is only 6,000 years. I've been heckled by people during workshops, but not that bad, I have to say. It's a challenge. It's a challenge because as a teacher, you never want to make a child uncomfortable in your classroom. in my case, personally, I treat them with a tremendous amount of respect, and I buy them books like Kenneth Miller, who's the author of my textbook, A Devout Catholic, and it's called Finding Darwin's God, or Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project. His book's called The Language of Science. And I give them books. I say, look, if you're going to look that way, listen to these guys. These guys at least know what they're talking about. I don't know. I'm optimistic. I think it's getting better. But we can see what Brandon thinks.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how have you had children read those books and then change their minds and be more? That's great.
First of all, Kenneth Miller writes back to those children if they reach out to him, which I think is super wonderful. He's a professor at Brown University. Number two, I had a child once who was terrible, faced the wall, refused to do assignments, and he was a really nice kid too, super bright, so it just kills you. I gave him both books, and then I had a sister 2 years later, and I was like, oh boy, here we go again. And she was fine. She was absolutely fine. So one day I was like, hey, Amanda, I thought maybe this time of the year you'd be a little uncomfortable in class. And she's like, oh, are you talking about my brother? I go, yeah. She goes, oh, he feels so bad about what he did to you. As a matter of fact, he's going to come and talk to you. He came back and apologized profusely and said that the books really helped him and that he was wrong. But he's an intelligent person, and intelligent people can be humble and notice when they've made a mistake about something. So that was a bit of a success story.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a great success story. I'm going to turn it over to Lincoln to ask Brandon some questions as well about his work in Florida. Thank you.
Fantastic. Hi, Brandon. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the challenges that are faced by educators and by advocates in Florida from an institutional and a policy standpoint. In particular, has the Florida legislature been advancing any legislation that could be harmful to secular education?
Well, first, hi, everybody. My name is Brandon Haught. I teach environmental science at the high school level to freshmen here in Volusia County on the east coast of Florida. I wrote a book, Going Ape, Florida's Battles Over Evolution in the Classroom, which details all the crazy things that have been happening about evolution education since the 1920s to the present day. And I also am the founding board member of an organization called Florida Citizens for Science. We've been around since 2006, and we've been essentially defending the teaching of sound science in our schools. So we've seen it all. My research, my book, I've read it all. What we're facing right now is two main issues. First of all, yes, there is a push in the state legislature over the past couple of years dealing with instructional materials. The first thing you think about when you say instructional materials is textbooks, and yes, that is a main thing, but we're also talking about handouts, magazine articles, the video that you used, all these things are instructional materials, and there's a very concerted effort to kind of, ban some materials, censor some materials. They're giving more and more power to individuals in the community who would come forward to their local school board and say, I don't like that, I'm going to challenge that. And then it triggers this whole new process of having to have an actual formal hearing and bring in witnesses. And it's a crazy drawn out deal. The whole objective is the push to censor these materials. Science is one of the materials that they're looking at. They're also looking at literature. They hate the way math is taught, all these different things. But science is definitely on their minds. I've actually attended a few school board meetings where these challenges were held, and they were ranting and raving against the teaching of evolution in the textbooks. They hated the presentation of climate change in the textbooks. So they were trying their hardest to get that stuff out of the textbooks. That's happening right now. It's not something like 50 years ago, it's happening now. And the second issue has to do with these private schools. Here in Florida, there's a huge push by our state legislature year after year to expand the school voucher program. What that essentially is giving money to individual families. They take that money and send their child to a private school. So it is, in fact, no matter how they try to disguise it and play the shell game, it is tax money. that is going to these private schools. The thing is that public schools are super duper heavily regulated. There's so many things we have to do and can't do, and teach this curriculum and do this and all this testing, but those private schools, not regulated in the least bit. You can have teachers who have no college degree, you can have the principal who has no college degree, and I have seen the science curriculum for some of these schools, and it is atrocious, the worst you can ever imagine. But that program is being expanded here in the state of Florida. And once again, that's not 50 years ago, it's happening right here in front of us right now.
It certainly sounds like there's an organized push by, well, I'll let you answer who's directly responsible for this, but in terms of getting parents to go and speak to school boards and in terms of lobbying the legislature, who is responsible for pushing this anti-science agenda? And what organizations, in addition to yours, Florida Citizens for Science, have been leading the coalition to respond to that and to defend secular science-based education?
Well, in my research or for the book, there has been so many organizations over the years that pop up, do their work, and fade away. Right now, the most current one, the organization is called the Florida Citizens Alliance. They've been around for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so. And they started at the local level, just pestering their local school board. Once they just couldn't get the resolution that they wanted at the local level, they started moving up. Now they are heavy hitters on the state level. Some members of that organization were actually appointed by our Governor DeSantis, when he was elected, to be on the doggone education transition team, a transition between governors. And so they have tons of influence now. They have lots of the ears of many lawmakers, which is why their push about instructional materials is becoming more and more successful over time. They have that influence. Now, as far as on the good guy side, as I would phrase it, yes, there's my organization, Florida Citizens for Science, but there's on the national level, there's the National Center for Science Education that we work hand in hand with. So if you happen to be in a state outside of Florida and you look and you can't find a Citizens for Science organization, go to the National Center for Science Education. They will hook you up with other people in your area, in your state, and maybe you can come together and do something about this.
That's fantastic, because you're right that these are challenges that are being faced in a lot of states where legislatures feel the need to go after the curriculum that we have in place. I'm curious if you had a few pieces of advice to give to advocates outside of Florida and other states where they're maybe seeing these threats. What are the lessons that you've learned in the years doing this? Where's the most impactful place that we can get involved and try to advocate? And how do we do that effectively and coalition build?
Well, what's amazing is that we are always on the defense. We're never on the attack because science education is more or less in the curriculum. And so it's in the curriculum, there's nothing for us to fight about until someone comes and challenges it. So my advice to everyone, be informed. You've got to know what's going on. No, you don't have to be the gadfly at all of your doggone school board meetings, but just be aware of what's happening. The biggest problem that many states have is that there is nothing organized and ready to go to defend science education until it's almost too late. Our opposition is already organized, they're on the attack, they're already got the ears of lawmakers, they're already got bills written and ready to go, and once it starts hitting the newspapers, man, we're way behind at that point. And now we're scrambling to put together a bunch of volunteers, get advocates together and go start doing our work, and we are so many steps behind them. It's really difficult to get people organized when there's nothing to be passionate about. So usually once the attack starts happening, that's when people start coming up on Facebook and Twitter and email and saying, oh my gosh, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Well, what we should have done is months ago got organized to get ready. So instead we're playing catch up. So my advice is right now, while nothing's happening right now, hopefully nothing's happening right now, go ahead and start talking to other science advocates. Go to the National Center for Science Education. Hey, can you help us get organized? And using that, then you can kind of get yourself ready and then be ready when the stuff hits the fan.
If I may add to that, I read Brandon's book, Going Ape, and Florida really is, as he says in the book, a microcosm of what happened in other parts of the country in terms of the history of the creationist evolution controversy. I learned a lot about how to be organized, how the other side, the bad guys, as Brandon says, are organized. It's a very informative book in that sense.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll be sure to send that book out. I think that's a really good strategy, getting to work early and organizing early, and it's certainly something that Jews for a Secular Democracy wants to empower our volunteers to do. I have one question from Rick in the chat here. He was hoping you could talk about private schools and the regulation on private schools. You mentioned there's been big expansion and big growth there with the taxpayer voucher programs. And if you could touch a little bit on what type of regulations do exist. You mentioned that some of their science education curriculums aren't sufficient. So I'd love to hear more about what that program looks like and in terms of how those have been growing through the state legislatures.
Well, here is the shock. There's no regulations. The Orlando Sentinel, our newspaper in Central Florida, the Orlando Sentinel did a whole series about, and they titled the series, Schools Without Rules, period. There are no regulations on these schools. Now, of course, some of the organizers that do organize all this voucher stuff and feed it out to the schools, they're going to say, well, yeah, they do have to take certain types of tests, and they do have to do. No, it's not, especially not in science. Maybe they are encouraged to take some type of English language test, but it's so much is not required, and especially in my field, science education, nothing is required. You can have any Joe Schmo teach the lesson. You can have them teach anything they want. And I've seen the textbooks they teach from. It is god-awful.
That's disheartening to hear, and really, I think, emphasizes the importance of our advocacy.
I think it's important to notice that for decades, when people say public education, it's meant in a bad way. Like, public education isn't good. And I almost feel like it's been intentionally that concept has been driven in there so that something like this in Florida can happen. When in actuality, I mean, here in Miami-Dade, some of our public schools are the best schools in the county are your public schools. And it's a shame that when we think public school, immediately we relate that to something negative. Because look at, with no regulation whatsoever, it's a complete opposite. I can't teach science without certification and everything else.
Yeah, I'm sitting here right now, and if you probably notice my video, I'm constantly looking off to the side. Well, I'm teaching right now because of this whole coronavirus thing. That my kids are home right now, and I'm looking at my email. I'm checking all the different stuff going on. So while you're talking, I'm over here like emailing students back and stuff like that. So I'm actually teaching right now.
I'm not, because this is officially spring break here in Miami. But I have a
spring break
webinar.
this last week.
I'll share it with you guys. I have a webinar on Tuesday night, the evolution of the coronavirus, and Thursday night, the evolution of the human brain, with the leading human brain scientist in the country, which is for my students. But for TIES, we open these webinars up for everybody.
And people can find that on your website?
Yes, yes. The evolution of the human brain one is already there. Under webinars, you can register. And it's Dr. Mark Reimers. And I love it because kids actually can interact with the scientists, which is so great. And I think he's going to do a Tuesday night for us on the evolution of the coronavirus because it's so current right now, unfortunately.
You would hope that with what's happening in the world today, people would, again, if they want to turn to religion for solace, but also recognize how essential science is.
Absolutely.
Perhaps, this is an opportunity, and yet I can't help but think that all of these forces at work are still there, and they're still pushing back on it, and there's still a lot of denial. I mean, when you talk about public schools, I'm here in New York. Almost all of my teachers growing up, a significant percentage of them were Jewish. The New York City public school system was predominantly a Jewish initiative for decades, and isn't the case anymore. And I'm a big supporter of public schools, and I know a lot of folks in our movement are and don't hear that kind of negative connotation when you talk about it. So it's very interesting to hear that people throw that around as kind of a negative thing, and or as someone pointed out in the chat, as almost a government education, as if this is some kind of socialist
Right.
plan to take over people's minds. I mean, when I was growing up, the public schools had a very positive connotation, and in my parents' generation as well. And I don't know how we get back to that.
I think it started in the 1980s with A Nation at Risk, which is a study that came out during the Ronald Reagan era.
Yeah.
But I have found the same thing in my school, that with the secular Jewish community, they are our greatest advocates in the public school system. I don't know if that's a generalization, but
no, I mean, it feels like certainly, and in many areas, Jews are disproportionately represented, but public school education was one of those fields, and I think in some ways still is, and is still a value for many Jews, but certainly an understanding of science is a value for a huge number of Jews, and to hear about this is very distressing. And so like 90 to 95%, I would estimate, of American Jewry would say no, the world is not 6,000 years old.
Yes, for sure.
But 5 to 10% would say it is, and that's all that those forces need to get up on stage with them to push back on science. And so that becomes our challenge as an organized Jewish community to be representative of the American Jewish community and say, overwhelmingly, we see the biblical story of creation as metaphor and not as science, and in most Jewish denominations, the answer is it can live side by side. It can be suggestive of certain things about the way the world came. You know, there are ways. Again, it doesn't have to be either or. For some of us, it is. But either way, let's listen to the experts. Let's hear from people who have spent decades in academia studying this stuff, who know it and trust them, or certainly trust the tens of thousands together, like what their consensus is. So that's kind of the world that we're in and the challenge that we're in. And I want to be mindful of our time because we were hoping to keep it to an hour. Someone in the chat, Peter mentions Betsy Voss.
Betsy DeVos. Hey, Paul, if I may, before we wrap up, I think there was a really good call to action question for Naftali that I think we can maybe ask each of the speakers to answer. And the question earlier was, what can mainstream Jewish organizations, and I would say, you know, supporters of Jews for Secular Democracy, do to support the work of YAFFED? And I think we could maybe ask Bertha and Brandon, what is your call to action for all the folks who tuned in today?
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So for us, it's a little bit hard to come up with a very single thing to do. I think some of the suggestions that were just made at the end of the second panel was great, to be very actively involved and following what's happening. I actually shared a link in the comments to our main opposition, Agudath Israel. They're powerful lobbyists. They have connections to Democrats, Republicans, everyone. When they host a luncheon in Albany, literally in the Capitol, everyone comes like ducks to give them, you know, to show how wonderful they are and how pandering they are. You know, government officials need to be called out when they're sacrificing kids. And there are various ways to do it. Obviously, like Paul mentioned, he came to a press conference. We do trips to Albany, and oftentimes we send out letters, so mass letters. We need people to sign on to it. I think what people could do right now is follow us on social media, Facebook and Twitter. Twitter is important because that's oftentimes where the reporters are at, and they follow, you know, the discussion. So that's a good way to be active and to see what's up, and then to be able to share it and get the word out there.
Yeah, I agree that we do need to, people just need to be educated and aware of this things going on. And as you said, one of the best ways to do that is to connect on social media. So Florida Citizens for Science also has a Facebook page that we keep updated, a Twitter feed, and I do recommend that you sign up on those just to stay informed.
Hi, same here. We have a TIE's Facebook page, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And again, tieseducation.org. We have t-shirts and mugs and tote bags. But the most important thing is tell your children's teachers, hey, you know, I heard about this great program, and maybe your science teachers at your school want a free workshop. Everything is available online, and just get the message out there that we're here to help.
Great, thank you. And of course, we're Jews for Secular Democracy is a new initiative, and we are ramping up our efforts, and we would love to have volunteer involvement. Lincoln, do you want to let people know how they can get involved with Jews for Secular Democracy?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sending a link in the chat right now for y'all to sign up to be volunteer leaders with Jews for a Secular Democracy. We are really focused right now on building a network of volunteers to help advocate for our mission, to help defend the separation of church and state on the ground all around the country. As we heard today, so much of what's going on, so much of these challenges that we need to respond to are challenges that we need to face at the local and the state level. There's only so much that we can do as a national group. We really need folks on the ground going and advocating and educating their community. So on the form that I sent there to sign up to be a volunteer, we'd love to hear how you can help, whether that's meeting with your elected officials and advocating to them, whether that's hosting a speaker or educating your community, perhaps your Jewish congregation, your synagogue, since we are a Jewish organization, or any other way that you think that you can help us advocate for secular government and push back on these challenges. We need people and we need tangible interactions with government officials, because that's what matters. Hearing from constituents, hearing from concerned citizens, that's what's going to really protect our democracy. So I hope y'all will volunteer with us. I hope to be in touch with you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that we're a nonprofit organization. So Jews for Secular Democracy is an initiative of Society for Humanistic Judaism. But if you want to focus any financial support to Jews for Secular Democracy and you give on our page, we're being very careful about only using whatever comes in for this initiative for the initiative. And I think that you can see the intelligence and energy that Lincoln and Sarah bring to this initiative, which I'm very excited about. And I'm looking forward to doing a lot of amazing things around separation of church and state from a Jewish perspective. And we hope to do more of these kind of conversations. So feel free to email us some suggestions about how we can make this better or smoother. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was a webinar type format, but we can also use Zoom to be more in conversation with everybody who has come on. And we'd be happy to do that as well. And we're just going to continue from there. So I again want to thank our panelists so much, Bertha and Naftali, and Brandon had a duck out already. And thank you to all of the attendees. And we hope to be in touch again soon. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paul, for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
See you soon. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.